deliberate steps, gathering her thoughts before delivering news that would transform their comfortable training environment into something far more dangerous. Gentlemen and ladies, at 0200 hours Pacific Time, Chinese forces initiated what appears to be a full-scale military operation against Taiwan. Satellite imagery shows amphibious assault ships departing mainland ports, while advanced surface-to-air missile batteries have been deployed along the coastal regions facing the island. Our intelligence assets have detected the activation of what appears to be a new generation of adaptive air defense systems that we've never encountered in operational conditions. The room erupted in a buzz of low conversations as pilots processed the implications of Walker's briefing. This wasn't another Middle Eastern counterinsurgency operation against technologically inferior opponents, but potential conflict with a near-peer adversary possessing advanced weapon systems and sophisticated tactics. Captain Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his usual confidence tempered by the realization that he might soon face enemies equipped with technology comparable to his own. Our mission is to provide immediate air support for the evacuation of American citizens from Taipei, Walker continued, her voice cutting through the murmur of pilot conversations. Intelligence reports suggest that Chinese forces have deployed experimental surface-to-air missile systems specifically designed to counter our stealth capabilities. These systems reportedly use adaptive tracking algorithms and multiple guidance modes that can defeat traditional electronic countermeasures. Major Rodriguez raised her hand, her F-22 pilot training evident in her systematic approach to threat assessment. Ma'am, do we have specific intelligence on the capabilities of these new SAM systems? My aircraft's electronic warfare suite should be able to analyze and counter most known guidance methods, but it would help to know what we're facing. Walker's expression darkened as she accessed classified briefings that painted an increasingly troubling picture of enemy capabilities. That's the problem, Cobra. These systems appear to incorporate artificial intelligence algorithms that can adapt their targeting methods in real time based on the countermeasures they encounter. Early reports from reconnaissance flights suggest that our standard jamming techniques may actually make our aircraft more vulnerable by providing the enemy systems with additional data to analyze our electronic signatures. The implications of this information settled over the room like a cold fog. For years, American pilots had trained under the assumption that their technological advantages would provide decisive superiority over any potential enemy. The concept of facing adaptive systems that could learn from and counter their own advanced capabilities had never been seriously considered in their tactical planning. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson stood up, his squadron commander instincts demanding more specific information about the threats they would face. Colonel, what's our engagement profile? Are we talking about close air support missions? Or will we be conducting beyond visual range intercepts using our standard standoff tactics? That's where this gets complicated, Walker replied, pulling up tactical displays that showed the geography around Taiwan in stark detail. The enemy has positioned their adaptive SAM systems in overlapping coverage zones that deny us the luxury of standoff engagement. Our evacuation routes require low-level penetration through heavily defended airspace, with surface-to-air threats at multiple altitude bands. Standard beyond visual range tactics won't work when we need to provide close escort for evacuation aircraft. Captain Park, whose F-35 was configured for ground attack missions, studied the threat displays with growing concern. Ma'am, my aircraft stealth capabilities are designed for high-altitude penetration missions. If we're talking about low-level flight in defended airspace, we lose most of our technological advantages while exposing ourselves to exactly the kind of threats these adaptive systems were designed to counter. The room fell silent as the full implications of their tactical situation became clear. The American pilots had trained extensively for conflicts where their advanced technology would provide overwhelming advantages over technologically inferior enemies, None of their training scenarios had prepared them for facing adaptive systems specifically designed to counter their most sophisticated capabilities. Walker accessed additional classified briefings that painted an even more troubling picture of enemy preparations. Intelligence suggests that Chinese forces have been studying our aircraft capabilities and tactics for years, specifically developing countermeasures for our stealth technology and electronic warfare systems. These adaptive SAM batteries reportedly include multiple radar frequencies, infrared tracking systems, and even optical targeting methods that can function effectively against stealth aircraft. Captain Martinez, whose F-22 represented the pinnacle of American air superiority technology, struggled to process the concept of facing enemies who had specifically prepared to counter his aircraft's advantages. "Colonel, are you saying that our stealth capabilities might actually be counterproductive in this environment?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Blade," Walker confirmed. Early reconnaissance reports suggest that these adaptive systems can actually use our own stealth coatings against us by detecting the specific ways our aircraft absorb and redirect radar energy. They've essentially turned our technological advantage into a targeting signature. The briefing continued with increasingly disturbing intelligence about enemy capabilities that seemed designed specifically to neutralize American technological advantages. The Chinese forces had apparently spent years analyzing American tactics, developing countermeasures for beyond visual range engagement techniques, and creating defensive systems that could adapt their responses based on the specific aircraft and weapons they encountered. Major Stevens, whose electronic warfare aircraft represented years of investment in jamming and deception technology, found his confidence shaken by reports that enemy systems could actually use jamming signals as targeting beacons. "Ma'am, if our electronic warfare capabilities are compromised, what alternatives do we have for penetrating defended airspace?" Walker's expression grew even more grim as she prepared to deliver the most challenging aspect of their mission briefing. That's where the situation becomes truly difficult. Intelligence reports suggest that the only American aircraft that have successfully penetrated these adaptive defenses have been older, non-stealth fighters using unconventional tactics that the enemy systems weren't programmed to counter. The room buzzed with confused conversations as pilots tried to understand how older aircraft could succeed where their most advanced fighters had failed. The concept contradicted everything they had learned about modern air combat, challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technology and tactical effectiveness. "Are you suggesting that stealth aircraft are more vulnerable than conventional fighters?" Morrison asked, his voice reflecting the disbelief shared by most of the younger pilots. "I'm telling you what our intelligence assets have observed," Walker replied. F-16s using low-level, high-speed penetration tactics with unpredictable flight patterns have been able to avoid engagement by these adaptive systems, while F-35s and F-22s using standard stealth penetration profiles have been consistently targeted and engaged. The implications were staggering. Years of training, billions of dollars in development costs, and fundamental assumptions about future air combat were being challenged by enemy systems that had specifically evolved to counter American technological advantages. The pilots found themselves facing the possibility that their most advanced capabilities might actually be liabilities in the coming conflict. Sarah Chen sat quietly in the back of the room, listening to the increasingly desperate tone of the briefing with the calm attention of someone who had faced similar challenges before. While her younger colleagues struggled to understand how their technological advantages could become vulnerabilities, she found herself thinking about missions from earlier in her career, when success had depended on pilot skill rather than advanced systems. The evacuation convoy will consist of 3 C-130 transport aircraft escorted by fighter aircraft through a gauntlet of adaptive SAM sites, Walker continued. The transport aircraft are loaded with American civilians evacuated from Taipei. including families with children and elderly individuals who cannot survive additional delays. Time is critical, as intelligence suggests that Chinese forces are advancing rapidly toward evacuation staging areas. The stakes were becoming clear. Hundreds of American lives depending on fighter escorts that might be flying aircraft specifically targeted by enemy defensive systems. The mission would require penetrating heavily defended airspace using tactics that had never been tested against adaptive threats, with failure meaning not just military defeat, but civilian casualties on a scale that would haunt everyone involved. "What's our timeline?" Rodriguez asked. Her F-22 pilot training focused on the practical aspects of mission planning. "Wheels up in 90 minutes, Walker replied. "The evacuation convoy is already airborne and approaching the edge of defended airspace. Chinese forces are advancing faster than expected, and we have a very narrow window for successful extraction before the situation becomes impossible." The room exploded in activity as pilots realized they would soon be flying combat missions against enemies specifically prepared to counter their aircraft and tactics. Training scenarios had never prepared them for the psychological pressure of knowing that their own technological advantages might work against them, or for the reality of facing adaptive systems designed by enemies who understood American capabilities better than the Americans themselves. As the formal briefing concluded and pilots began their individual mission preparations, Sarah Chen remained seated while her colleagues filed out with expressions ranging from grim determination to barely concealed fear. She had flown similar missions before, when technological advantages were luxuries rather than necessities, and when pilot skill and tactical ingenuity could overcome superior enemy systems through unconventional approaches. The enemy had prepared for American technology, but they had prepared for the wrong war. The tarmac erupted into controlled chaos as ground crews swarmed around aircraft that would soon carry their pilots into combat against an enemy specifically prepared to kill them. Fuel trucks raced between fighters while ordnance teams loaded missiles designed for beyond visual range engagements that intelligence reports suggested would be impossible in the adaptive threat environment. Sarah watched the frantic preparations with the detached calm of someone who had seen similar scenes before, recognizing the underlying fear that drove even experienced personnel to work with unusual urgency. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson gathered his pilots around a portable briefing board, positioned next to his F-16E, his expression reflecting the weight of leading aviators into a tactical situation unlike anything they had trained for. The squadron's most experienced combat leader, Thompson had flown missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, but those conflicts had involved technologically inferior enemies who posed conventional threats. This mission would test whether American training and doctrine could adapt to facing sophisticated adversaries armed with systems specifically designed to exploit American weaknesses. "Listen up," Thompson called, his voice cutting through the noise of aircraft engines and maintenance equipment. "Intelligence has updated our threat assessment, and the situation is worse than we thought. The Chinese have deployed their adaptive SAM systems in overlapping coverage zones that create a virtually impenetrable defensive barrier using conventional penetration tactics. Our F-35s and F-22s are being specifically targeted by systems that can track stealth aircraft more effectively than conventional fighters." Captain Morrison adjusted his helmet bag nervously, his confidence in his V-35's capabilities shaken by reports that suggested his $80 million aircraft might be more vulnerable than Sarah's 3-decade-old F-16. "Sir, what are our alternatives? If stealth penetration isn't viable, how do we escort the evacuation convoy through defended airspace?" Thompson's expression darkened as he accessed classified tactical assessments that painted an increasingly desperate picture. "That's the problem. Razor, our doctrine assumes technological superiority and standoff engagement capabilities. We've never developed tactics for penetrating adaptive defenses using conventional aircraft against near-peer adversaries who understand our capabilities. Major Rodriguez stepped forward, her F-22 pilot background evident in her systematic approach to tactical problem-solving. "Sir, what about electronic warfare support? Can Major Stevens's jamming aircraft create enough confusion to mask our approach?" "Negative," Thompson replied grimly. "Intelligence reports suggest that these adaptive systems actually use our jamming signals as targeting beacons. The more electronic warfare we employ, the easier we make it for enemy systems to lock onto our aircraft. We're essentially providing them with additional data to refine their tracking algorithms." The implications settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. Years of training had prepared them to rely on technological advantages that might now work against them, while their enemies had specifically prepared countermeasures for American tactics and equipment. The pilots found themselves facing the terrifying possibility that their most sophisticated capabilities could become death traps in the adaptive threat environment. Captain Park raised her hand tentatively, her ground attack background making her acutely aware of surface-to-air threats. "Sir, what about low-level penetration using terrain masking? If we stay below radar coverage and use unpredictable flight paths, might that confuse the adaptive tracking systems?" "That's been tried," Thompson answered, consulting briefing materials that detailed earlier reconnaissance missions. Conventional low-level tactics work to some extent, but these adaptive systems include multiple tracking modes, including infrared and optical targeting. They can engage aircraft at any altitude using guidance methods we haven't encountered before. "Sarah." Chen stood quietly at the edge of the group, listening to the increasingly desperate tactical discussions while mentally reviewing lessons learned from conflicts that predated adaptive defensive systems. Her colleagues were struggling to understand how to fight an enemy who had studied American methods and developed specific countermeasures, but she had faced similar challenges before when flying against adversaries who compensated for technological inferiority through tactical innovation and local knowledge. "Phoenix," Thompson called, recognizing her presence and desperate for any tactical insights that might help his pilot survive the coming mission. "You've got more experience with unconventional SAM threats than anyone here. Any ideas about how to penetrate adaptive defenses?" The younger pilots turned toward Sarah with expressions ranging from polite skepticism to desperate hope. They had dismissed her experience as obsolete just hours earlier, but the reality of facing enemies specifically prepared to counter their technological advantages had shaken their confidence in modern doctrine. Morrison's usual arrogance had been replaced by genuine concern, while Rodriguez showed the focused attention of someone realizing that her advanced training might prove inadequate. Sarah studied the tactical display showing the evacuation route through defended airspace, her experienced eye recognizing patterns that the younger pilots had missed. "The adaptive systems are designed to counter known American tactics and aircraft signatures," she observed. "They've programmed responses for stealth penetration, beyond visual range engagement, and electronic warfare techniques. But they've prepared for the war they expect us to fight, not necessarily the war we have to fight." "What do you mean?" Park asked, her ground attack experience making her appreciate unconventional approaches to heavily defended targets. "These systems adapt to countermeasures and aircraft signatures they've been programmed to recognize," Sarah explained. "But adaptation requires pattern recognition, and pattern recognition depends on predictable behavior. If we can't rely on stealth or electronic warfare, we need to rely on unpredictability." Thompson leaned forward with interest, recognizing that Sarah might possess tactical knowledge that could compensate for their technological disadvantages. "Explain." Sarah traced the evacuation route on the display, identifying terrain features that could be exploited using tactics that predated computer-controlled defensive systems. Low-level penetration using random altitude changes, unpredictable direction shifts, and terrain masking techniques that create tracking solutions too complex for automated systems to solve quickly. The adaptive algorithms need time to analyze flight patterns and calculate intercept courses. If we can deny them that time by constantly changing our parameters, we might be able to penetrate their defenses. The concept was simultaneously simple and radical. Instead of relying on technological superiority, use pilot skill and tactical unpredictability to confuse enemy systems designed to counter conventional approaches. Morrison looked skeptical. His F-35 training, emphasizing systematic approaches and technological solutions, rather than the kind of improvisational flying Sarah was describing. "Ma'am, that sounds like old-school dogfighting applied to surface-to-air threats," Morrison observed. "Modern SAM systems have reaction times measured in milliseconds. How can manual flight maneuvers confuse computer-controlled targeting?" Sarah's smile carried the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had survived conflicts by understanding enemy limitations rather than trusting friendly advantages. "Because computers are predictable, Captain. They analyze data, identify patterns, and calculate optimal solutions based on program parameters. But if you can create situations where the data doesn't fit established patterns, you can force the system into processing loops that delay targeting solutions." The tactical discussion continued as pilots struggled to understand concepts that contradicted their technological training. The idea of deliberately flying in ways that confused friendly systems as well as enemy defenses seemed counterintuitive to aviators accustomed to precise flight profiles and computer-assisted navigation. But the alternative was attempting conventional penetration against adaptive defenses specifically designed to counter their aircraft and tactics. Major Stevens, whose electronic warfare background made him acutely aware of the technological challenges they faced, studied Sarah's proposed flight profiles with growing interest. "Phoenix, are you suggesting that we deliberately avoid using our most advanced systems to prevent the enemy from identifying our aircraft signatures?" "I'm suggesting that we use whatever works," Sarah replied. "If that means flying like it's 1991 instead of 2024, then that's what we do. The mission is getting those evacuation aircraft through defended airspace, not proving that our technology is superior to theirs." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything the younger pilots had been taught about modern air combat. Their training had emphasized the systematic application of technological advantages, coordinated tactics using data-linked aircraft, and engagement profiles that maximized the effectiveness of advanced weapon systems. Sarah was proposing that they abandon these approaches in favor of improvisational flying techniques that relied on pilot skill rather than aircraft capabilities. Thompson checked his watch, recognizing that time was running out for tactical discussions. While American civilians waited for escort through increasingly dangerous airspace. "Phoenix, can you lead a flight using these unconventional tactics? The evacuation convoy is already approaching the edge of defended airspace, and we need immediate escort coverage." The question carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate mission. Thompson was essentially asking Sarah to take responsibility for proving that obsolete tactics could succeed where modern doctrine had failed, using her own aircraft and life as the test case for concepts that contradicted decades of technological development. The younger pilots would be following her into combat using techniques they had never practiced, trusting their lives to tactics that seemed to violate everything they understood about aerial warfare. Sarah looked around the group, seeing the mixture of hope and skepticism in the faces of pilots who had dismissed her experience just hours earlier. They were desperate enough to consider her unconventional approaches, but their technological training made them instinctively doubt tactics that didn't rely on advanced systems and coordinated data sharing. The mission would test not just her flying skills, but her ability to lead pilots who had never learned to trust anything except their computers. "I'll take the lead aircraft," Sarah said finally. "Morrison Rodriguez, you're with me. We'll use low-level penetration with random flight parameters designed to confuse adaptive tracking systems. Stevens, I want you in trail position using minimal electronic emissions. If these systems use our own signals against us, we deny them that advantage." The pilots exchanged glances that reflected their discomfort with abandoning established doctrine, but also their recognition that conventional approaches had already proven inadequate against adaptive defenses. Morrison's usual confidence had been replaced by nervous energy, while Rodriguez showed the focused intensity of someone preparing for the most challenging mission of her career. Thompson nodded grimly, understanding that he was authorizing a tactical approach that violated established safety protocols and operational procedures. "Phoenix, you're cleared to lead the escort flight using whatever tactics you think will work. The evacuation convoy needs coverage in 30 minutes, and you're our best hope for getting those civilians home safely." The words carried the weight of hundreds of lives depending on tactics that existed only in Sarah's memory and experience. She would be flying into combat against enemies specifically prepared to kill American pilots, using an aging aircraft and techniques that her own colleagues considered obsolete. But somewhere over the Taiwan Strait, transport aircraft loaded with American families were approaching defenses that had already proven capable of defeating the world's most advanced fighters. Sarah Chen climbed toward her F-16 with the steady pace of someone who had made similar walks before, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether experience could triumph over technology, and whether the oldest pilot in the squadron could succeed where the youngest had failed. Enemy was waiting with adaptive systems designed to kill American aircraft. But they had prepared for the wrong pilot. The F-16's engine spooled up with the familiar whine of a Keiko Pratt & Whitney turbofan that had powered fighter aircraft for over 4 decades. Its mechanical simplicity, a stark contrast to the complex power plants that drove the squadron's more advanced fighters. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. Each switch position and gauge reading burned into her memory through thousands of hours of repetition. Unlike the glass cockpit surrounding her, every instrument in her aircraft required individual attention, forcing her to maintain the kind of systems awareness that modern pilots delegated to computers. Morrison's F-35 sat nearby, its sleek profile bristling with sensors and antennas that connected the aircraft to a vast network of information systems. The younger pilot was struggling with his own pre-flight procedures, but his challenges were different from Sarah's mechanical checks. Morrison had to verify data links, confirm sensor fusion parameters, and ensure that his aircraft's computers were properly integrated with friendly force tracking systems. His pre-flight routine resembled a software startup sequence more than traditional aircraft preparation. "Viper 77, you're cleared for taxi," came the voice of the tower controller, his tone carrying the professional calm that masked the tension everyone felt about the mission ahead. Sarah released her parking brake and began the familiar process of maneuvering her aircraft toward the active runway, her movements precise despite the weight of knowing that hundreds of civilian lives depended on the success of tactics that existed nowhere in current Air Force doctrine. The taxi route took her past the base operations center, where she could see the silhouettes of officers gathered around displays showing real-time intelligence about the developing crisis over Taiwan. Satellite imagery revealed Chinese forces advancing faster than expected, while radar plots showed the adaptive SAM systems tracking every aircraft that approached the defended airspace around the evacuation routes. The enemy was ready, their preparations specifically designed to counter American technological advantages. Rodriguez's F-22 taxied behind Sarah's F-16, the Raptor's angular stealth profile making it look like something from a science fiction film compared to the conventional lines of the older fighter. The contrast was more than aesthetic. It represented fundamentally different approaches to aerial warfare. Rodriguez's aircraft was designed to dominate through technological superiority and beyond visual range engagement. while Sarah's F-16 had been built for close-range combat, where pilot skill mattered more than advanced systems. Phoenix lead, this is Razor 2. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio as his F-35 joined the formation. I'm showing multiple radar contacts consistent with adaptive SAM deployment. My systems are having difficulty classifying the threat signatures because they don't match known parameters. Sarah keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Copy that, Razor. Remember, we're not trying to defeat these systems through technological superiority. We're going to confuse them through unpredictable behavior that their programming can't anticipate. The runway stretched ahead like a concrete bridge between their familiar training environment and an aerial battlefield where their enemies held every technological advantage except one. They had prepared to fight American pilots who would behave predictably, following established doctrine and employing conventional tactics. Sarah's plan violated every principle of modern air combat, but it also represented the kind of tactical innovation that had characterized successful military operations throughout history. Tower, Viper 77 requesting immediate departure. Sarah transmitted as she lined up on the runway centerline. The tower's response was immediate, clearing her for takeoff in disguise that would test whether 4 decades of flying experience could overcome adaptive defensive systems specifically designed to kill aircraft like hers. The afterburner kicked in with a thunderous roar that Sarah felt through every rivet of her aircraft, acceleration pressing her back into her ejection seat as the F-16 gathered speed down the runway. At exactly 150 knots indicated airspeed, she pulled back on the stick and felt the familiar sensation of wheels leaving concrete as her fighter climbed into the Nevada dawn. Behind her, Morrison and Rodriguez followed in their own aircraft, trusting their lives to tactics they had never practiced and barely understood. Nellis departure, Viper 77 flight departing to the west, requesting direct routing to the Taiwan operations area. Sarah transmitted as she established the flight in a loose formation that would allow for the radical maneuvering she planned to employ once they reached defended airspace. The flight across the Pacific would take several hours, providing time for her wingmen to understand the unconventional tactics they would need to survive against adaptive threats. Sarah used the transit time to explain concepts that contradicted everything they had learned about modern air combat: the importance of random altitude changes, the value of unpredictable timing, and the counterintuitive idea that appearing incompetent to enemy systems might be the key to survival. The adaptive algorithms are designed to predict our behavior based on observed flight patterns, she explained over the radio as they crossed into international airspace. If we fly predictable profiles, the systems can calculate intercept courses and weapon firing solutions. But if we constantly change our parameters in ways that seem random, we force the computers into processing loops that delay their targeting solutions. Morrison's voice reflected his struggle to understand tactics that violated his technological training. Phoenix lead, this sounds like you're asking us to fly badly on purpose. How do we maintain formation integrity and tactical coordination if we're constantly changing altitude and heading? We don't maintain tight formation, Sarah replied. We operate as individual aircraft using mutual support rather than coordinated tactics. Each pilot becomes responsible for his own survival while contributing to the overall mission success. It's how fighter pilots operated before data links and sensor fusion made coordination automatic. The concept was revolutionary for pilots who had learned to rely on computer-assisted formation flying and automated tactical coordination. Rodriguez's F-22 was designed to share targeting information with other aircraft, creating a networked battlefield where individual pilots contributed to collective awareness. Sarah was proposing that they abandon these advantages in favor of the kind of individual initiative that had characterized aerial warfare in previous generations. As they approached the edge of the Taiwan operations area, the intelligence picture became increasingly grim. Radio transmissions from earlier reconnaissance flights described adaptive SAM systems that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously, using guidance methods that defeated traditional countermeasures. F-35s and F-22s had been consistently targeted and forced to withdraw, while the few successful penetrations had been achieved by older aircraft using unconventional tactics. Phoenix lead, I'm picking up multiple radar emissions consistent with adaptive tracking systems, Rodriguez reported from her F-22, her advanced sensors providing detailed analysis of the electromagnetic environment ahead. These signatures don't match anything in our threat libraries. The computers are having difficulty categorizing the emissions. Sarah studied her own simpler radar warning receiver, noting the strobing lights that indicated active radar illumination from multiple directions. Her F-16 systems couldn't provide the detailed analysis available to Rodriguez's Raptor, but they could tell her what she needed to know. Enemy defenses were active and searching for targets to engage. All aircraft, this is Phoenix lead, Sarah transmitted as they approached the defended airspace where the evacuation convoy would need protection. From this point forward, we operate under radio silence, except for emergencies. Follow my lead and remember that survival depends on unpredictability, not technology. The first adaptive SAM site appeared on her radar warning receiver as a persistent tone that indicated active tracking. Unlike traditional surface-to-air missiles that provided brief warning before launch, these systems maintained continuous lock-on while analyzing target behavior and calculating optimal engagement parameters. Sarah could feel the electronic eyes of the enemy focused on her aircraft, computers processing data about her speed, altitude, and heading while preparing to launch weapons specifically designed to kill American fighters. She pushed her stick forward and dove toward the ocean surface, simultaneously rolling into a steep bank that changed her heading by 40 degrees in a matter of seconds. The maneuver violated every principle of efficient flight operations, wasting fuel and energy while exposing her aircraft to potential structural stress. But it also created tracking solutions that didn't fit the predictable patterns the adaptive systems had been programmed to counter. Morrison and Rodriguez followed her down, their more advanced aircraft struggling to match the radical maneuvering of her older F-16. The F-35 and F-22 had been designed for smooth, efficient flight profiles that maximized their stealth and sensor capabilities. The violent direction changes Sarah was employing forced their computer systems to work harder to maintain stable flight, while their pilots struggled to understand the tactical logic behind such apparently wasteful maneuvering. Jesus, Phoenix, Morrison muttered over the radio before catching himself and returning to radio silence. His F-35's flight control computers were fighting his inputs, trying to maintain optimal flight parameters while he attempted to duplicate Sarah's erratic flight path. The first missile launch came without warning, a surface-to-air weapon that appeared on Sarah's radar warning receiver as a fast-moving contact climbing rapidly from one of the adaptive SAM sites. Unlike traditional missiles that followed predictable intercept courses, this weapon seemed to anticipate her flight path, adjusting its trajectory in real time based on observed target behavior. Sarah's response violated every principle of modern missile evasion tactics. Instead of employing electronic countermeasures or following established evasive maneuvers, she pitched her aircraft into a vertical climb that bled off airspeed at an alarming rate, then rolled inverted and dove toward the water in a spiral that would have been considered suicidal under normal circumstances. The missile, programmed to intercept targets following logical evasion patterns, struggled to adapt to her apparently irrational behavior. The weapon passed behind her aircraft by less than 50 feet, its proximity fusing detonating in a fireball that lit up the dawn sky. Sarah felt the shock wave buffet her F-16 as she pulled out of her dive barely 100 feet above the ocean surface, her airspeed dangerously low but her aircraft intact. Behind her, Morrison and Rodriguez had observed her survival technique with amazement and terror, recognizing that conventional missile evasion would have resulted in certain death. "That's how we do it," Sarah thought to herself as she resumed her erratic flight path toward the evacuation convoy's position. "We fly like madmen because that's the only thing they didn't program their computers to handle." The adaptive systems had been designed to counter rational tactical behavior, but Sarah Chen wasn't flying rationally. She was flying with the desperation of someone who understood that survival depended on doing exactly the opposite of what enemy computers expected, even when that meant violating every safety protocol and efficiency standard that modern aviation had developed. Ahead, the evacuation convoy needed protection from enemies who had never faced a pilot crazy enough to fly like the laws of physics were merely suggestions rather than absolute limits. The evacuation convoy appeared on Sarah's radar as 3 large contacts, flying in tight formation at low altitude. Their C-130 Hercules transports, loaded with American civilians evacuated from Taipei in the final hours before Chinese forces could close the escape routes. The lumbering cargo aircraft represented everything vulnerable about military aviation: slow, ungainly, and completely dependent on fighter escort for survival in hostile airspace. Inside those aircraft, families with children huddled in canvas seats, their lives depending on pilots. They would never meet flying tactics that existed nowhere in military doctrine. "Phoenix Lead, this is Cargo 77, came the voice of the lead transport pilot, his calm professionalism masking what Sarah knew must be terror at flying through defended airspace in an aircraft designed for peacetime logistics rather than combat operations. "We have you on radar approaching from the southeast. Request immediate escort coverage as we're showing multiple SAM sites tracking our formation." Sarah keyed her microphone briefly, breaking radio silence for the first time since entering the threat environment. "Cargo 77, Phoenix Lead has you covered. Maintain current heading and altitude. Do not, repeat do not, attempt evasive maneuvers unless specifically directed." The transport aircraft were flying exactly as they had been trained: straight, level, and predictable. Their size and radar signatures made stealth impossible, while their limited maneuverability meant that conventional evasive tactics would be ineffective against adaptive missile systems. The T-130s represented perfect targets for surface-to-air weapons, but they also carried precious cargo that made their survival the only metric that mattered for mission success. Morrison's F-35 was struggling to maintain formation with Sarah's erratic F-16, his advanced flight control systems, fighting every radical maneuver as he attempted to duplicate her unpredictable flight patterns. The Lightning II had been designed for smooth, efficient operations that maximized its stealth characteristics and sensor capabilities. The violent direction changes Sarah employed forced his aircraft's computers to work overtime maintaining stable flight, while his training screamed against tactics that seemed to violate every principle of aerial warfare. Rodriguez's F-22 faced similar challenges. Her Raptor's sophisticated systems designed for beyond visual range engagement rather than the close-range chaos that Sarah was creating around the evacuation convoy. The F-22's stealth characteristics became meaningless at the low altitudes and high-energy maneuvers Sarah employed, while its advanced sensors provided detailed information about threats that she was engaging through intuition rather than systematic analysis. The first coordinated missile attack came from 3 different SAM sites simultaneously, adaptive systems launching weapons in a pattern designed to bracket the evacuation convoy and eliminate any possible escape routes. Sarah watched the missiles climb on her radar warning receiver, their trajectories converging on the transport aircraft with computer-calculated precision that should have guaranteed successful interception. Instead of positioning herself between the missiles and the transports, Sarah did something that violated every principle of escort tactics. she flew directly toward the nearest SAM site at maximum speed, her F-16's afterburner painting a thermal signature that drew the attention of infrared tracking systems. Her aircraft became a more attractive target than the lumbering transports, but only if she could maintain the kind of unpredictable flight profile that confused the adaptive targeting algorithms. The missiles adjusted their trajectories to engage her aircraft, their guidance systems calculating intercept courses based on her observed flight parameters. Sarah waited until the weapons committed to their attack profiles, then executed a maneuver that defied both physics and common sense. She chopped her throttles to idle and deployed her speed brakes while simultaneously pulling into a vertical climb, bleeding off airspeed so rapidly that her aircraft nearly stalled. The first missile, programmed to intercept a target maintaining normal fighter aircraft energy levels, flew past her rapidly decelerating F-16 and detonated harmlessly ahead of her position. The second weapon attempted to adjust its trajectory, but Sarah had already rolled inverted and entered a split-S maneuver that pointed her aircraft toward the ground while building airspeed for her next impossible direction change. Morrison watched this display of aerobatic insanity with amazement and growing understanding. Sarah wasn't just evading missiles. She was teaching the adaptive systems to expect certain behaviors, then violating those expectations in ways that forced the computers into processing errors. Her tactics were simultaneously brilliant and suicidal, requiring pilot skills that exceeded the design limitations of her aircraft while creating exactly the kind of unpredictable environment where technology became a liability rather than an advantage. The third missile attempted to engage Rodriguez's F-22, but the Raptor pilot had learned from Sarah's example. Instead of relying on her aircraft's electronic countermeasures, Rodriguez pulled into a steep climb followed by a wingover that bled off energy while changing her heading by 90 degrees. The maneuver violated F-22 operating procedures and stressed her aircraft's airframe, but it also created a tracking solution that the adaptive guidance system couldn't solve quickly enough to maintain target lock. Cargo 77, continue on present heading, Sarah transmitted as she pulled out of her dive and resumed her position near the evacuation convoy. Phoenix flight will maintain close escort using defensive maneuvering. The transport pilots maintained their steady course while fighter aircraft cavorted around them like protective spirits, their radical maneuvering creating a bubble of confusion that adaptive systems couldn't penetrate. The contrast was stark, cargo aircraft flying with professional precision, while their escorts violated every principle of efficient flight operations in order to create the chaos necessary for survival. The second wave of missiles came from a different direction, launched by adaptive systems that had analyzed the first engagement and adjusted their tactics accordingly. These weapons approached from multiple altitudes and angles, their guidance systems programmed to counter the evasive maneuvers they had observed during the previous attack. The enemy computers were learning, adapting their responses based on observed American behavior. Sarah recognized the tactical evolution and responded with her own adaptation. Instead of repeating successful evasive maneuvers, she employed completely different tactics that bore no resemblance to her previous actions. When missiles approached from her left, she turned toward them rather than away, closing the range so rapidly that their guidance systems couldn't adjust their intercept calculations. When weapons climbed from below, she dove to meet them, creating high-speed passing encounters that provided insufficient time for proximity fusing to function effectively. Morrison found himself developing an appreciation for the tactical genius behind Sarah's apparent madness. The adaptive systems were designed to learn from American behavior, but they could only learn from patterns that repeated often enough to establish predictable responses. Sarah was deliberately avoiding patterns, employing random tactics that provided no useful data for enemy analysis while creating exactly the kind of chaotic environment where pilot skill mattered more than computer processing power. The evacuation Convoy pressed deeper into defended airspace, while their escorts continued their defensive dance around the lumbering transports. Sarah's fuel gauge showed consumption rates that exceeded normal parameters, her radical maneuvering burning aviation. Gasoline at an alarming rate. But fuel efficiency was meaningless if the alternative was allowing American civilians to die because their escorts couldn't penetrate adaptive defenses using conventional tactics. Rodriguez's F-22 was experiencing similar fuel consumption issues. Her Raptor's efficient engines working overtime to maintain the kind of energy levels necessary for extreme maneuvering. The F-22 had been designed for sustained supersonic flight and long-range missions, not for the energy-intensive aerobatics that Sarah's tactics required. Rodriguez found herself managing fuel consumption while simultaneously trying to master flying techniques that her training had never covered. The third missile engagement involved weapons launched from 6 different sites, adaptive systems coordinating their attacks to overwhelm the defensive capabilities of conventional fighter aircraft. The missiles approached in waves designed to force American pilots into predictable evasion patterns that subsequent weapons could exploit. It was a tactical approach that should have guaranteed success against any target following established doctrine. Sarah's response demonstrated why experience mattered more than advanced training in situations that exceeded the parameters of simulation scenarios. Instead of treating each missile as an individual threat requiring specific countermeasures, she flew her F-16 as if the weapons were part of a complex aerobatic sequence that required precise timing and energy management. She dove towards some missiles while climbing away from others, creating 3-dimensional maneuvering that confused tracking systems designed to predict 2-dimensional flight profiles. Morrison's F-35 was pushed to its structural limits as he attempted to duplicate Sarah's impossible flying, his aircraft's computer systems generating warning messages about excessive G-forces and dangerous flight parameters. The Lightning II's sophisticated flight controls were designed to prevent pilots from exceeding safe operating limits, but Sarah's tactics required exactly the kind of extreme maneuvering that computers were programmed to prohibit. The young pilot found himself fighting his own aircraft as much as the enemy missiles, his V-35 safety systems trying to prevent him from performing maneuvers that his training told him were necessary for survival. It was a technological irony that perfectly illustrated the limitations of advanced systems. Computers designed to protect pilots could also prevent them from employing tactics necessary for mission success when conventional approaches proved inadequate. Rodriguez experienced similar conflicts between her training and the requirements of their tactical situation. Her F-22 systems provided detailed information about missile trajectories and optimal evasion techniques, but the recommended responses assumed conventional threats rather than adaptive weapons, specifically designed to counter American tactics. She found herself ignoring her aircraft's computers and flying by instinct, using skills that predated the technological revolution in military aviation. The evacuation convoy continued its steady progress through the defended airspace while their escorts created an expanding sphere of chaos around them. Transport aircraft loaded with American families flew straight and level, while fighter pilots performed aerobatic displays that would have been considered reckless under any other circumstances. The tactical situation was unprecedented, slow, vulnerable aircraft surviving because their escorts were willing to fly in ways that confused enemy computers more effectively than any electronic countermeasure. Sarah's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission from one of the transport aircraft. Phoenix lead, this is Cargo 77. We've got a visual on the extraction point. Estimate 10 minutes to the landing zone. How's our escort coverage? The question carried implications that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. The evacuation convoy was approaching the end of their journey through defended airspace, but landing at the extraction point would require even more precise coordination between transport aircraft and their fighter escorts. Sarah would need to maintain her chaotic defensive tactics, while simultaneously providing close air support for vulnerable aircraft conducting landing operations in an environment where enemy forces continued to pose significant threats. She keyed. Her microphone, her voice steady despite the physical exhaustion of flying extreme maneuvers for over an hour. Cargo 77, Phoenix lead. Escort coverage remains effective. Continue approach to extraction point. Will maintain defensive perimeter during your landing operations. The final phase of their mission would test whether unconventional tactics could provide protection for the most vulnerable phase of the evacuation operation. The emergency beacon from Morrison's F-35 pierced the combat frequency like a death knell. Its automated distress signal announcing that the most advanced fighter in the fighter. Its automated distress signal announcing that the most advanced fighter in this advanced fighter in the Chitian American arsenal had finally succumbed to the adaptive missile systems that had been stalking their formation for the past hour. Sarah watched the fireball bloom in her peripheral vision as she continued her protective orbit around the evacuation convoy, her heart sinking with the knowledge that a pilot young enough to be her son had just paid the ultimate price for tactics that she had convinced him to employ. "Mayday, mayday, this is Razor 2. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, strained but alive as his ejection seat carried him clear of his disintegrating aircraft. "I'm punching out at 2,000 feet. Coordinate grid 77 Alpha. Phoenix lead, the adaptive systems figured out my pattern. They waited until I repeated a maneuver, then launched a missile specifically timed for that flight profile." The loss of Morrison's F-35 sent shockwaves through the remaining aircraft that extended far beyond tactical implications. An $80 million fighter had been destroyed by enemies who had learned to counter American technology through systematic observation and adaptive programming. Worse yet, Morrison's survival depended on rescue operations in hostile territory where Chinese forces were advancing rapidly toward American positions. Rodriguez's voice reflected the strain of watching her wingman shot down while struggling to maintain the kind of unpredictable flying that had kept her own F-22 alive against impossible odds. "Phoenix lead, I'm showing multiple ground units converging on Razor's position. We need immediate search and rescue support, but my fuel state is approaching emergency levels from all this defensive maneuvering." Sarah's own fuel gauge showed dangerously low readings that reflected the cost of flying tactics that violated every principle of efficient operations. Her F-16 had been burning aviation gasoline at nearly twice the normal rate due to constant afterburner usage and extreme maneuvering, while the stress of combat flying had pushed both her aircraft and her aging body to their limits. At 58, she lacked the physical resilience of younger pilots, but she also possessed knowledge that had proven more valuable than advanced technology. "Cargo 77, this is Phoenix lead," she transmitted to the evacuation convoy still approaching their extraction point. "Continue to landing zone as planned. Cobra and I will provide cover for both your extraction and search and rescue operations for our downed pilot." The tactical situation had become exponentially more complex with Morrison's shootdown. Sarah now faced the challenge of protecting vulnerable transport aircraft during landing operations while simultaneously coordinating rescue efforts for a downed pilot in territory rapidly being overrun by enemy forces. The adaptive missile systems continued to track her aircraft, learning from each engagement and preparing countermeasures for tactics that had previously proven successful. The first Chinese ground units appeared on her targeting pod display as armored vehicles racing toward Morrison's ejection site with the speed of forces that had been specifically positioned to capture downed American pilots. Intelligence reports had suggested that Chinese forces prioritized pilot capture as both a propaganda victory and a source of information about American capabilities. Morrison's survival now depended on rescue operations conducted under fire. In hostile territory. Phoenix Lead. This is Pedestal 1-1, came a new voice on the rescue frequency, identifying himself as the pilot of an HH-60 rescue helicopter approaching Morrison's position from a staging area outside the immediate threat zone. I need immediate air support for pilot recovery. Ground forces are converging on the survivor's location, and I don't have the capability to defend against armored vehicles. Sarah found herself facing decisions that would have challenged experienced combat leaders: how to protect multiple vulnerable aircraft simultaneously, while engaging ground targets using weapons designed for air-to-air combat. Her F-16 carried Sidewinder missiles optimized for engaging enemy fighters, not the kind of precision-guided munitions needed for close air support in urban terrain where American pilots might be captured. The evacuation convoy began its descent toward the extraction airfield. 3 C-130 transports loaded with civilian refugees, conducting approach procedures that made them sitting ducks for any surface-to-air weapons within range. The transport pilots were flying with the professional competence of cargo aircraft crews, but their missions had never included landing operations in active combat zones where adaptive missile systems could engage them during their most vulnerable phase of flight. Rodriguez's F-22 was struggling with fuel consumption issues that threatened to ground the most capable air superiority fighter in the American inventory at exactly the moment when air cover was most desperately needed. The Raptor's efficient engines had been pushed beyond design specifications by the extreme maneuvering required to survive against adaptive threats, while its pilot was experiencing the physical exhaustion that came from flying high-G maneuvers for extended periods without relief. Phoenix Lead. On showing less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates, Rodriguez reported, her voice tight with the strain of managing aircraft systems while maintaining the kind of unpredictable flight patterns that confused enemy tracking systems. If I don't find a tanker soon, I'll be ejecting over hostile territory just like Razor. The fuel crisis added another layer of complexity to an already impossible tactical situation. Sarah's formation was disintegrating due to combat losses and logistical limitations at precisely the moment when multiple vulnerable aircraft required fighter protection. The evacuation convoy needed escort during landing operations. Morrison required air support for his rescue, and Rodriguez needed immediate aerial refueling to remain effective in the combat environment. Sarah made the kind of command decision that separated experienced leaders from technically competent pilots. She would have to prioritize mission objectives based on the greatest good for the greatest number of people, even if that meant accepting unacceptable risks to individual aircrew members. The evacuation convoy carried hundreds of American civilians whose survival justified extraordinary risks, while Morrison's rescue, though critically important, involved only one person. Cobra, proceed immediately to the aerial refueling track, she transmitted to Rodriguez. Get your fuel situation resolved, then return to provide air support for rescue operations. I'll maintain coverage for the evacuation convoy during landing operations. The decision meant that Sarah would be alone against adaptive missile systems that had already proven capable of destroying the most advanced fighters in the American arsenal. Her aging F-16 would face threats that had defeated F-35s and F-22s, but she would do so using tactics that existed only in her memory and experience. The coming minutes would test whether 4 decades of flying could overcome technological advantages specifically designed to kill aircraft like hers. The first adaptive SAM sight locked onto her aircraft as Rodriguez departed for aerial refueling, its tracking systems analyzing her flight patterns with the methodical precision of computers programmed to learn from previous engagements. Sarah could feel the electronic attention focused on her F-16 like a physical weight, enemy algorithms processing data about her speed, altitude, and heading while calculating optimal firing solutions for weapons designed to kill American fighters. She responded with maneuvers that seemed to violate the basic physics of flight. A vertical climb followed immediately by an inverted dive. Energy management that treated fuel consumption as irrelevant compared to the need for unpredictability. Her F-16 bucked and protested against inputs that exceeded normal operational parameters, but the aircraft responded with the reliability that had made it a favorite of pilots who needed machines that could survive extreme conditions. The evacuation convoy touched down at the extraction airfield with the professional precision of transport pilots conducting peacetime operations, their C-130s rolling out on a runway that had been hastily prepared for refugee evacuation operations. Ground crews raced to unload American civilians who had endured hours of flight through combat zones, families with children and elderly individuals who represented the human cost of international conflict. Morrison's survival beacon continued to transmit from his position in hostile territory, its electronic signal providing exact coordinates for rescue operations, while simultaneously alerting enemy forces to his location. Chinese ground units were approaching his position with the systematic advance of forces specifically trained for pilot capture operations, their armored vehicles equipped with communications equipment that would allow immediate exploitation of any intelligence they could extract from captured American aircrew. Phoenix Lead. This is Pedestal 1-1 approaching survivor location. The rescue helicopter pilot transmitted, his voice professional despite the danger of conducting recovery operations in territory controlled by enemy forces. I need immediate air support against ground vehicles converging on the survivor. My defensive armament is insufficient for engaging armored threats. Sarah dove toward the ground vehicles threatening Morrison's position, her F-16s targeting systems struggling to acquire point targets that moved unpredictably through urban terrain. Her air-to-air missiles were designed for engaging aircraft at long ranges, not for precision strikes against ground vehicles operating near friendly forces. She would need to employ tactics that predated precision-guided munitions, using her aircraft's cannon in low-level attack runs that exposed her to ground fire from multiple directions. The first strafing run brought her within small arms range of Chinese infantry, their automatic weapons creating streams of tracer fire that lit up the dawn sky like deadly fireworks. Sarah's F-16 shuddered as projectiles struck her aircraft's armored surfaces, but the fighter's robust construction absorbed the damage while she walked cannon fire across the lead vehicle in Morrison's rescue formation. Good hits, Phoenix Lead. Morrison called from his position on the ground, his voice carrying the relief of someone who had watched enemy forces approaching his hiding place for the past 30 minutes. The lead vehicle is disabled, but I count at least 6 more armored units in the area. The rescue helicopter appeared over the horizon like a mechanical angel, its rotor disc reflecting sunlight as the pilot approached Morrison's position with the kind of precision flying that characterized special operations aircrew. But the HH-60 was vulnerable to ground fire during the hover required for pilot recovery, dependent on fighter support to suppress enemy weapons during the critical minutes when rescue operations made both aircraft sitting targets. Sarah's fuel gauge showed readings that made continued operations questionable, her F-16 consuming aviation gasoline at rates that exceeded any sustainable mission profile. But Morrison's life depended on air support that only she could provide, while the evacuation convoys still required protection during their vulnerable ground operations. The mission was expanding beyond the capabilities of available resources, forcing decisions that would determine who lived and who died in the chaos of adaptive warfare. The adaptive missile systems had been analyzing her tactics throughout the engagement, their algorithms processing data about her flight patterns while preparing countermeasures, specifically designed to counter her unconventional approaches. Sarah could feel the electronic attention focused on her aircraft, intensifying as enemy computers developed targeting solutions based on observed behavior patterns. She knew that her luck was running out, that continued operations against learning systems would eventually result in successful missile engagement against her aircraft. But hundreds of American civilians were depending on her protection, while Morrison's survival required air support that no other aircraft could provide in the current tactical environment. The choice was simple: continue flying until fuel exhaustion, or enemy action ended her effectiveness, or abandon missions that would result in American casualties. For Sarah Chen, there was no choice at all. The Pentagon briefing room fell silent as General Patricia Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, concluded her presentation to the assembled defense officials and congressional representatives. The satellite imagery displayed on the wall-mounted screens told a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. An aging F-16, flown by a 58-year-old pilot, had succeeded where the most advanced fighters in the American arsenal had failed, penetrating adaptive defenses that had been specifically designed to counter stealth technology and network-centric tactics. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes said, her voice carrying the weight of conclusions that would reshape military doctrine for decades to come, "Colonel Sarah Chen's mission represents a paradigm shift in how we understand the relationship between technology and tactical effectiveness. Her successful penetration of Chinese adaptive defenses using unconventional tactics has provided intelligence that will fundamentally alter our approach to future conflicts." The assembled officials studied combat footage that showed Sarah's F-16 performing maneuvers that violated every principle of efficient flight operations, while successfully protecting evacuation aircraft that carried hundreds of American civilians to safety. The video evidence was irrefutable. Conventional tactics employing advanced technology had failed, while improvised approaches using older equipment had achieved complete mission success against the same threats. Secretary of Defense William Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression reflecting the discomfort of someone whose strategic assumptions had been proven catastrophically wrong. "General, are you telling us that our most expensive weapon systems were actually counterproductive in this engagement? That stealth technology and sensor fusion made our aircraft more vulnerable rather than less?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Mr. Secretary," Hayes replied, accessing classified analysis that painted an even more troubling picture of American vulnerabilities. The Chinese adaptive systems were specifically programmed to counter F-35 and F-22 signatures and flight characteristics. Our technological advantages became targeting signatures that enemy systems could exploit more effectively than conventional aircraft signatures. The implications resonated through the briefing room like shock waves from an explosion. Billions of dollars invested in advanced fighter aircraft had produced weapons that were more vulnerable to sophisticated enemies than the systems they were designed to replace. The technological revolution that had dominated American military thinking for 2 decades had been turned against itself by adversaries who understood American capabilities better than Americans themselves. Colonel Marcus Thompson sat in the rear of the briefing room, his expression reflecting the personal impact of tactical revelations that had cost him nearly half his squadron. His F-16E had been damaged by adaptive missile systems during the evacuation operation, forcing an emergency landing that left him temporarily grounded while investigators analyzed the effectiveness of different aircraft types against adaptive threats. "The most significant finding," General Hayes continued, "is that Colonel Chen's unconventional tactics weren't just effective against adaptive systems. They were the only tactics that proved consistently successful. Every conventional approach, regardless of the aircraft employed, resulted in mission failure or aircraft loss." The briefing continued with detailed analysis of combat recordings that showed Sarah's F-16 surviving multiple missile engagements that had destroyed more advanced aircraft. Her tactics violated established doctrine, so thoroughly that military analysts had initially assumed the recordings showed equipment malfunctions rather than deliberate pilot techniques. Only after extensive investigation had they confirmed that apparent flying errors were actually sophisticated countermeasures against adaptive targeting systems. Captain Morrison's rescue had become a case study in the limitations of technology-dependent operations. His V-35's advanced sensors and stealth characteristics had made him more vulnerable to adaptive defenses than Sarah's conventional F-16, while his training had emphasized systematic approaches that enemy computers could predict and counter. His survival had depended on rescue operations conducted by pilots employing tactics that existed nowhere in current military doctrine. The investigation into the Taiwan operations had revealed systematic weaknesses in American tactical thinking that extended far beyond individual aircraft capabilities. Training programs emphasized technological solutions and coordinated operations that created predictable patterns enemy systems could exploit. Pilots learned to trust computer systems more than their own judgment, developing dependencies that became critical vulnerabilities when facing adaptive threats. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the Pentagon's senior analyst for artificial intelligence warfare, presented findings that challenged every assumption about the future of military aviation. The adaptive systems employed by Chinese forces represent a new category of threat that specifically targets the decision-making processes of modern military pilots. She explained, "These systems don't just counter our technology, they exploit our tactical doctrine and training methods." Her analysis revealed that adaptive defenses worked by analyzing American behavior patterns and predicting future actions based on observed doctrine. Pilots who followed established procedures became vulnerable to systems that had been programmed to anticipate conventional responses. Only completely unpredictable behavior could confuse adaptive algorithms enough to prevent successful targeting. Solutions. Colonel Chen's success came from abandoning systematic approaches in favor of intuitive flying that created decision trees too complex for enemy computers to solve quickly. Dr. Warren continued, "Her tactics worked because they violated the logical frameworks that adaptive systems use to predict target behavior. The technological implications were staggering. American military superiority had been built on the assumption that advanced systems would provide decisive advantages over less sophisticated enemies. The Taiwan crisis had demonstrated that sophisticated enemies could turn American technological advantages into vulnerabilities by developing countermeasures, specifically designed to exploit systematic approaches and predictable behavior patterns." Congressional representatives struggled to understand how billions of dollars in advanced weapons development had produced aircraft that were more vulnerable than the systems they replaced. The F-35 program alone had cost over $400 billion to develop, making it the most expensive weapon system in military history. The revelation that F-35s were more vulnerable to adaptive defenses than F-16s, built in the 1980s, challenged fundamental assumptions about defense spending and technological progress. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, raised questions that cut to the heart of American military strategy. General Hayes, "Are you suggesting that we've been developing weapon systems that actually make our forces less effective against sophisticated enemies? That older equipment might be more suitable for future conflicts than advanced technology?" "I'm suggesting that we've been preparing for the wrong kind of war," Hayes replied. "Our doctrine assumes technological superiority and systematic approaches will provide decisive advantages. But adaptive enemies can counter systematic approaches more easily than improvised tactics based on pilot skill and experience." The discussion shifted to personnel policies that had systematically removed older pilots from operational assignments in favor of younger aviators who were more comfortable with advanced technology. Sarah Chen's success had demonstrated that experience might be more valuable than technical proficiency when facing adaptive threats. But Air Force policies had been pushing experienced pilots toward retirement or non-operational assignments. Colonel Chen was scheduled for mandatory retirement next year, General Hayes noted. Her success against adaptive defenses came from knowledge and skills that we've been systematically eliminating from our pilot force in favor of technology-dependent approaches. The revelation sparked heated debate about personnel policies that had prioritized technological proficiency over tactical experience. Military leaders had assumed that advanced training and sophisticated equipment would compensate for reduced experience levels. But the Taiwan crisis had proven that some knowledge could only be gained through years of operational flying in challenging conditions. Major Rodriguez had provided detailed debriefings about her own experiences during the evacuation mission, describing how her F-22's advanced systems had actually hindered her ability to employ the unconventional tactics necessary for survival against adaptive threats. Her training had emphasized systematic approaches and computer-assisted decision-making that became liabilities when facing enemies specifically prepared to counter American doctrine. The irony, Rodriguez had observed during her debriefing, is that my aircraft's most advanced capabilities made it harder to fly the kind of random, unpredictable patterns that confused enemy systems. Colonel Chen's F-16 responded to her inputs without computer intervention, allowing her to employ tactics that my flight control systems were programmed to prevent. The investigation had also revealed significant intelligence failures that had underestimated Chinese capabilities while overestimating American technological advantages. Intelligence assessments had focused on comparing technical specifications rather than analyzing how adaptive systems might exploit American tactical dependencies. The result had been strategic surprise when American forces encountered threats specifically designed to counter their most sophisticated capabilities. Dr. Warren's analysis extended beyond immediate tactical implications to fundamental questions about the future of military aviation. Adaptive defense systems represent a paradigm shift in warfare that favors improvisation over systemization, she explained. Future conflicts may require pilots who can think and act outside established doctrine rather than within computerized decision frameworks. The implications for military training programs were revolutionary. Flight schools had been emphasizing computer literacy and systems management over traditional flying skills, producing pilots who were proficient with advanced technology but lacked the improvisational abilities demonstrated by Sarah Chen. Future training would need to balance technological competence with the kind of tactical flexibility that could counter adaptive threats. Colonel Chen's post-mission debriefings had provided insights that would reshape tactical doctrine for decades to come. Her descriptions of adaptive system behavior patterns had revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by pilots willing to abandon conventional approaches in favor of unpredictable tactics. But implementing such approaches would require fundamental changes in training methods and equipment design. The most important lesson, Sarah had told investigators, is that adaptive systems are still computer programs, even when they can learn from experience. They analyze data and make decisions based on program parameters. If you can create situations where their data doesn't fit established decision trees, you can force them into processing errors that delay targeting solutions long enough to survive. The Pentagon briefing concluded with recommendations that would fundamentally alter American military aviation doctrine. Future fighter aircraft would need to balance advanced capabilities with pilot override systems that allowed unconventional tactics. Training programs would emphasize tactical flexibility and improvisation alongside technological proficiency. Most importantly, experienced pilots like Sarah Chen would be retained in operational assignments rather than being pushed toward retirement. The warfare of the future would require both advanced technology and human judgment, with victory going to forces that could adapt their tactics faster than enemy systems could counter them. Sarah Chen had proven that sometimes the oldest pilot in the squadron was also the most valuable, and that experience remained the one advantage that no computer could replace. The recommendation was unanimous. Colonel Sarah Chen would be promoted to Brigadier General and tasked with developing new tactical doctrine that combined technological capabilities with the kind of improvisational flying skills that had saved hundreds of American lives over the Taiwan Strait. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a new class of fighter pilots at Nellis Air Force Base, her weathered hands pointing to tactical displays that showed adaptive threat scenarios no computer simulation could replicate. The students were different, now a mix of young hotshots with their technological confidence tempered by reality, and recalled veterans whose experience had suddenly become precious rather than obsolete. Technology will always advance, she told them, watching faces that showed newfound respect for lessons learned through decades of flying. But the enemy advances too. They study our systems, analyze our tactics, and prepare countermeasures we haven't imagined yet. Your job isn't to trust your computers blindly, it's to think faster than enemy algorithms can adapt. Morrison, fully recovered from his ejection and newly promoted to major, sat in the front row taking notes like his life depended on it. Because now he understood that it did. His F-35 had been the most advanced fighter in the world, but it had taken Sarah's 40-year-old F-16 and her 6 decades of accumulated wisdom to bring him home alive. The base had changed too. Aircraft maintenance schedules now included time for pilots to develop intimate knowledge of their machines. Training scenarios emphasized improvisation alongside precision. Most importantly, mandatory retirement ages had been quietly extended for pilots whose experience couldn't be downloaded or programmed. Sarah's final slide showed a simple message. In a world of adaptive enemies, the most advanced weapon is still the human mind. As the class filed out, she smiled, knowing that somewhere in the Nevada desert, the next generation of pilots was learning that sometimes being called too old to fly was just preparation for proving everyone wrong. What did you think of this incredible story of courage against impossible odds? If you enjoyed watching Sarah prove that experience can triumph over technology, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more inspiring stories like this one. Share this video with anyone who's ever been underestimated. Because of their age sometimes, wisdom is the greatest weapon of all. Colonel Sarah Phoenix. Chen's calloused fingers gripped the throttle of her aging F-16 as enemy surface-to-air missiles streaked past her canopy. While back at Nellis Air Force Base, the young hotshots who'd called her a museum relic watched in stunned silence as their state-of-the-art stealth fighters fell from the sky one by one. At 58, she was supposed to be grounded, teaching simulator courses to pilots half her age. But when the experimental enemy defense system proved immune to modern warfare tactics, the Air Force discovered that sometimes the oldest tricks were the only ones that worked. The Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base as Colonel Sarah Chen completed her final walk-around inspection of Viper 77, her F-16C Fighting Falcon. The aircraft was old by military standards. Built in 1987, when Reagan was president and the Berlin Wall still divided Europe. Its gray paint showed the wear of 3 decades of service, with patches and touch-ups that told stories of missions spanning from the Persian Gulf to Afghanistan. Unlike the sleek F-35 Lightning Eyes that dominated the flight line with their angular stealth profiles and glass cockpits, Sarah's Viper looked like what it was: a proven warrior from an earlier era. Still babying that antique Phoenix? The voice belonged to Captain Jake Rezer Morrison, 28 years old and fresh from the F-35 training pipeline at Luke Air Force Base. His flight suit was pristine, adorned with patches from advanced tactical schools and modern warfare academies. He represented everything the Air Force valued in its current generation of pilots: technologically savvy, systems-oriented, and completely confident in the superiority of digital warfare. Morrison's F-35 sat nearby, its sensors and stealth coding, representing billions of dollars in research and development, designed to make aerial combat a matter of superior technology rather than pilot skill. Sarah didn't look up from checking her aircraft's control surfaces, running her hands along the leading edge of the wing with the practiced motion of someone who had performed this inspection thousands of times. "She's gotten me home from places your GPs wouldn't even recognize, Razor," she replied evenly. Her voice carried the slight rasp of a career spent breathing oxygen at altitude, shouting over engine noise, and breathing desert dust on foreign airfields. The younger pilot laughed, a sound that carried just enough edge to make it clear he wasn't entirely joking. "That's what I mean, ma'am. All that old-school stick and rudder stuff might have worked when you were dodging SAMs over Baghdad. But modern air combat is about information superiority and stealth. My aircraft can engage targets beyond visual range while remaining completely invisible to enemy radar. I don't need to see the enemy to kill them." Around them, the morning briefing was breaking up as pilots from the 64th Aggressor Squadron prepared for another day of training exercises. Nellis was the home of advanced tactical training for the U.S. Air Force, where America's best pilots came to learn how to fight and win against the most sophisticated threats in the world. The base hummed with the constant activity of aircraft, maintenance, flight operations, and the endless cycle of briefings, missions, and debriefings that kept the world's most advanced Air Force sharp and ready. But Sarah Chen felt increasingly out of place in this high-tech environment. At 58, she was one of the oldest active pilots in the Air Force, a dinosaur from an era when pilots flew by feel as much as by instruments. She had logged over 4,000 hours in fighters, with combat time spanning 3 decades, and 4 different conflicts. She had flown missions when GPS was experimental technology, when pilots navigated by dead reckoning and landmark recognition, when air-to-air combat meant getting close enough to see the whites of your enemy's eyes. Her colleagues meant no disrespect with their comments about her age and methods, but the constant reminders that her time was ending wore on her spirit, like sandpaper on metal. Every conversation seemed to include references to retirement, to making way for younger pilots, to the inevitable march of technological progress that was leaving her behind. The Air Force Personnel Center had been sending her increasingly direct hints about transition opportunities, suggesting positions in training commands or staff assignments that would ease her toward civilian life. The briefing room at the 64th Aggressor Squadron was a temple to modern warfare technology. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time satellite imagery, threat assessment matrices, and electronic warfare spectrums that would have seemed like science fiction when Sarah first strapped into a fighter cockpit. The pilots gathered around these displays represented the cream of American aviation, graduates of the Air Force Academy and various flight training programs, holders of advanced degrees in engineering and computer science, experts in electronic warfare and network-centric combat operations. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Viper Thompson commanded the squadron with the efficiency of someone who had grown up in the digital age. At 42, he was young enough to be comfortable with constant technological change while experienced enough to command respect from pilots who had flown in actual combat. Thompson had made his reputation flying F-22 Raptors in Syria, using advanced sensors and beyond visual range missiles to achieve air superiority without ever seeing the enemy aircraft he destroyed. Today's exercise involves a new threat scenario, Thompson announced, his laser pointer dancing across a tactical display that showed the Nevada desert from a bird's-eye view. Intelligence suggests that near-peer adversaries have developed advanced surface-to-air missile systems with adaptive tracking capabilities. These systems can defeat traditional countermeasures and pose a significant challenge to our stealth aircraft. The assembled pilots leaned forward with interest. This was the kind of cutting-edge threat assessment that kept American air power ahead of potential enemies. Sarah listened with the attention of someone who had faced real missiles in real combat, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from the briefing. The focus was entirely on technological solutions, upgraded electronic warfare, suites, improved radar-absorbing materials, enhanced jamming systems. There was no discussion of tactics that didn't rely on technology, no consideration of how pilots had survived and succeeded before computers made all the decisions. "Captain." Morrison raised his hand. "Sir, have we identified specific countermeasures for these adaptive systems? My 35's electronic warfare suite should be able to analyze and counter most known SAM guidance methods." Thompson nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need, Razor. The F-35's integrated sensor fusion gives us unprecedented situational awareness. Combined with our stealth capabilities, we should be able to neutralize these threats before they can effectively engage us." Other pilots chimed in with similar observations, all focused on technological solutions and the superiority of their advanced aircraft systems. Sarah found herself thinking about missions from earlier in her career, when pilots survived through cunning and experience rather than electronic countermeasures. She remembered flying low-level penetration routes through hostile territory, using terrain masking and unpredictable flight patterns to avoid surface-to-air missiles that were technologically inferior but operated by crews who knew their business. "Phoenix, you've got more SAM evasion experience than anyone in this room," Thompson said, apparently reading her thoughts. "Any wisdom from the old days that might apply to these new threats?" The question was asked with respect, but Sarah detected the underlying assumption that her experience was primarily historical rather than tactical. She stood up slowly, feeling the weight of decades of flying in her joints, and walked to the tactical display. The younger pilots watched with the polite attention typically reserved for war stories from retired veterans. "The thing about surface-to-air missiles," she began, "is that they've been trying to kill fighter pilots for 60 years. Technology changes, but fundamental physics doesn't. Missiles have to intercept a moving target, which means they have to predict where you're going to be. If you can make that prediction impossible, the missile fails regardless of how advanced its guidance system is." Morrison leaned back in his chair with a barely concealed smirk. "Ma'am, with respect, modern SAM systems use multiple guidance modes and adaptive algorithms. They're not like the ESA-2 South you faced in Iraq. These systems can adjust their intercept calculations in real time based on target behavior." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the technical accuracy of his statement while recognizing the condescension behind it. "You're absolutely right about the technology, Captain. But missiles still have to obey the laws of physics. They still have maximum G-force limitations, finite fuel supplies, and guidance systems that can be overwhelmed by sudden changes in flight parameters." She traced a route on the digital map with her finger, showing a flight path that seemed to violate several principles of modern tactical flying. Instead of maintaining altitude for maximum sensor range and stealth effectiveness, her route hugged the terrain, using mountain ridges and valleys to mask radar signatures. Rather than flying straight lines that maximize speed and fuel efficiency, her path included seemingly random direction changes that would confuse predictive targeting systems. "This is interesting from a historical perspective," Thompson said. "Diplomatically, but our current doctrine emphasizes standoff engagement and stealth penetration. We avoid close-range SAM encounters entirely by operating beyond their effective range." The implicit message was clear. Sarah's experience was valuable as a teaching tool, but modern warfare had evolved beyond the need for her particular skill set. The younger pilots nodded in agreement, comfortable with their technological advantages and confident that superior systems would overcome any tactical challenges they might face. The mission briefing continued with detailed discussions of flight profiles optimized for stealth aircraft, coordination procedures for beyond visual range engagements, and electronic warfare tactics that relied heavily on automated systems. Sarah listened with growing unease, recognizing a dangerous over-reliance on technology that reminded her of previous conflicts where American forces had learned harsh lessons about the limitations of advanced systems. After the briefing, she walked out to the flight line with the familiar weight of her survival gear and the comfortable bulk of her G-suit. Other pilots were conducting their own pre-flight inspections, but their procedures seemed rushed compared to her methodical approach. They trusted their aircraft's built-in diagnostic systems to identify problems, while Sarah preferred the hands-on inspection methods that had kept her alive through thousands of hours of flying. Her F-16 might be old, but she knew every rivet, every system, every quirk that made it unique among the hundreds of similar aircraft she had flown. The younger pilots flew aircraft that were essentially interchangeable, with standardized cockpits and automated systems that minimized the differences between individual machines. Sarah's relationship with her aircraft was more personal, built on years of shared experiences and mutual trust. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its harsh beauty a constant reminder that flying was still a dangerous profession, despite all the technological advances. Sarah had seen too many good pilots die in crashes that no amount of technology could prevent, had attended too many funerals for aviators who trusted their systems more than their instincts. She understood that progress was inevitable and necessary, but she also knew that some lessons could only be learned through experience, and some skills could only be developed through years of practice under dangerous conditions. As she climbed into her cockpit and began the familiar routine of pre-flight checks, Sarah Chen couldn't know that within hours, her old-fashioned flying skills would be the only thing standing between her squadron and disaster. The advanced threats they would face that day would prove immune to modern countermeasures, and the young pilots who had dismissed her experience would find themselves desperately dependent on tactics they had never learned. The enemy was about to demonstrate that sometimes the oldest pilot in the squadron was also the most dangerous. The gleaming F-35 Lightning II represented everything the modern Air Force believed in. Stealth technology that rendered aircraft nearly invisible to enemy radar, sensor fusion systems that processed information from dozens of sources simultaneously, and beyond visual range weapons that could engage targets from distances measured in dozens of miles rather than thousands of feet. Captain Morrison's aircraft was worth over $80 million, packed with technology that would have seemed like pure fantasy when Sarah first learned to fly. The cockpit of Morrison's F-35 resembled a video game more than a traditional fighter aircraft. Instead of the analog gauges and mechanical switches that filled Sarah's F-16, Morrison worked with a massive touchscreen display that showed him a god's-eye view of the battlefield. Every aircraft within 100 miles appeared as a symbol on his screen, with data links providing real-time information about friendly and enemy positions. His helmet-mounted display system could overlay targeting information directly onto his field of vision, allowing him to engage threats without even looking at his instruments. The distributed aperture system gives me complete spherical awareness, Morrison had explained to a group of visiting dignitaries the previous week, his pride in the technology evident in every word. I can see threats approaching from any direction, including directly behind me. The aircraft's stealth coating makes us nearly invisible to enemy sensors, while our own sensors can track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. The F-35 program had cost over $400 billion to develop, making it the most expensive weapon system in military history. Every aspect of the aircraft had been designed to give American pilots an overwhelming technological advantage over any potential enemy. The Pentagon's doctrine assumed that superior sensors, stealth technology, and network-centric warfare would allow smaller numbers of American aircraft to defeat larger enemy forces through information dominance rather than traditional dogfighting. Skills. Major Lisa "Cobra" Rodriguez flew the squadron's newest F-22 Raptor, an air superiority fighter designed specifically to achieve and maintain control of the skies through technological supremacy. Her aircraft could cruise at supersonic speeds without using afterburners, a capability called supercruise that gave her significant tactical advantages. The F-22's stealth characteristics were even more advanced than the F-35's, making it virtually invisible to most radar systems until it was too late for enemies to respond effectively. "The beauty of fifth-generation aircraft," Rodriguez often said, "is that we can engage the enemy before they even know we're there. By the time their radar operators detect us, their aircraft are already falling out of the sky." The Raptor's AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles could engage targets at ranges exceeding 50 miles, guided by active radar homing systems that required no input from the launching aircraft once fired. Rodriguez could launch multiple missiles at different targets, then turn away to safety while her weapons found their marks with lethal precision. This capability, known as shoot and scoot, represented the modern Air Force's preferred method of aerial combat: engage at maximum range, rely on superior technology, and avoid close-range encounters where pilot skill might matter more than advanced systems. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's own aircraft was an F-16E, a modernized version of Sarah's fighter that included many of the same technological upgrades found in the fifth-generation fighters. His cockpit featured digital displays instead of analog gauges, an upgraded radar system with synthetic aperture mapping capabilities, and electronic warfare equipment that could jam enemy communications and radar systems. While not as advanced as the F-35 or F-22, Thompson's aircraft still represented a significant technological leap beyond Sarah's older model. The squadron's tactical doctrine reflected this faith in technological superiority. Their standard operating procedures assumed that American aircraft would detect enemy threats first, engage at beyond visual range, and achieve mission success through superior sensors and weapons rather than traditional air combat maneuvering. Pilots trained extensively on systems management and information processing, learning to interpret the vast amounts of data their aircraft could collect and analyze. "Modern air combat is about managing information flow," Thompson explained during a recent training seminar. "The pilot who can process and act on sensor data most quickly will dominate the engagement. Individual flying skills matter less than understanding how to use your aircraft systems effectively." This philosophy extended to their training exercises, which emphasized coordinated attacks using data-linked aircraft operating as nodes in a larger network. Pilots learned to share targeting information instantaneously, coordinate missile launches for maximum effectiveness, and maintain situational awareness through electronic systems rather than visual observation. The exercises were highly scripted affairs, with predetermined roles for each aircraft, and carefully controlled scenarios that highlighted the advantages of their technological systems. Captain Jennifer Venom Park flew another F-35, her aircraft configured specifically for ground attack missions. Her weapons bay could carry precision-guided bombs with GPS guidance systems accurate to within 3 meters of their intended targets. She could identify and engage ground-based threats from altitudes and distances that made visual targeting impossible, relying entirely on sensor data and satellite navigation to complete her missions. "I can put a 2,000-pound bomb through a specific window from 20 miles away," Park had demonstrated during a recent live-fire exercise. "The enemy never sees us coming, and by the time our weapons impact, we're already heading home." The squadron's maintenance personnel worked with computer diagnostic systems that could identify potential problems before they became critical failures. Their aircraft were monitored constantly by sensors that tracked everything from engine temperature to hydraulic pressure, with data transmitted automatically to ground-based maintenance computers for analysis. This predictive maintenance approach was designed to maximize aircraft availability while minimizing the risk of in-flight emergencies. Chief Master Sergeant David Wrench Johnson supervised the maintenance operations with the efficiency of someone who had grown up alongside the technological revolution in military aviation. His younger technicians were specialists in specific systems rather than general aircraft mechanics, trained to work with computer interfaces and digital diagnostic equipment rather than the hands-on troubleshooting methods that had characterized earlier generations of military maintenance. These new birds practically maintain themselves, Johnson often observed. The computer tells us what's wrong, orders the parts automatically, and even schedules the repair procedures. It's a far cry from the days when we had to figure out problems by listening to engine sounds and feeling for vibrations. The base's command and control systems reflected the same faith in technological solutions. The operations center resembled a NASA mission control facility, with banks of computer screens displaying real-time information about aircraft positions, weather conditions, and potential threats. Controllers could track every aircraft within hundreds of miles, coordinate complex missions involving dozens of aircraft, and provide tactical guidance based on sensor data collected from multiple sources. Colonel Amanda Ice Walker commanded the base with the cool efficiency of someone who had built her career during the transition to network-centric warfare. She had flown F-16s early in her career, but had spent most of her time in staff positions, managing the integration of new technologies and developing tactics that maximize their effectiveness. Walker represented the modern Air Force's leadership philosophy, technologically sophisticated, systems-oriented, and focused on achieving objectives through superior information processing rather than individual heroics. The days of lone wolf pilots are over, Walker frequently reminded her officers. Modern air combat requires coordinated team efforts using integrated systems. Our advantage comes from our ability to collect, process, and act on information faster than our enemies. The squadron's training scenarios reflected this technological bias, with exercises designed to showcase the capabilities of their advanced aircraft while minimizing variables that might favor experience over systems. Proficiency. Enemy threats were simulated using computer models that behaved predictably, responding to countermeasures in ways that validated the effectiveness of American technological solutions. Major Tom Hawk Stevens flew one of the squadron's electronic warfare aircraft, an F-16 configured with jamming equipment designed to disrupt enemy communications and radar systems. His aircraft could generate false targets on enemy radar screens, mask the signatures of friendly aircraft, and intercept enemy communications for intelligence purposes. Stevens represented the Air Force's belief that electronic warfare could provide decisive advantages without requiring direct engagement with enemy forces. "We can make their radar operators see whatever we want them to see," Stevens explained during a recent demonstration. Ghost aircraft, false missile launches, non-existent threat formations. By the time they figure out what's real and what's electronic deception, the real attack is already over. The base's simulation facilities allowed pilots to practice against computer-generated threats that behaved according to programmed parameters. These synthetic enemies responded to countermeasures in predictable ways, reinforcing the pilots' confidence in their technological advantages while failing to prepare them for adversaries who might not follow the expected scripts. Captain Alex Blade Martinez flew an F-22 configured for air-to-air combat, his aircraft loaded with missiles designed to engage enemy fighters at ranges where traditional dogfighting skills were irrelevant. Martinez had never experienced close-range aerial combat, having trained exclusively in beyond visual range scenarios, where sensor capabilities and missile technology determined the outcome of engagements. Close-range dogfighting is a relic of the past, Martinez often stated with the confidence of someone who had never been proven wrong. Modern missiles and sensors make it impossible for enemy aircraft to get close enough for traditional air combat maneuvering to matter. The squadron's younger pilots shared this confidence in their technological superiority, having learned to fly in an era when computer systems handled most of the complex calculations required for aerial combat. They trusted their aircraft's automated systems to provide optimal solutions to tactical problems, rarely questioning whether their technological advantages might prove insufficient against unconventional threats. The base's intelligence officers briefed pilots using satellite imagery and electronic intercepts that painted a comprehensive picture of potential threats around the world. Their assessments emphasized the technological capabilities of enemy aircraft and surface-to-air missile systems, analyzing threats in terms of radar frequencies, missile ranges, and electronic warfare capabilities rather than the tactical ingenuity of enemy operators. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen's F-16 sat at the far end of the flight line like a museum piece surrounded by technological marvels. Her aircraft lacked the stealth coatings, advanced sensors, and network connectivity that defined modern fighters, but it also represented something the newer aircraft had lost: simplicity, reliability, and the kind of robust design that could function effectively even when sophisticated systems failed. The contrast between Sarah's analog cockpit and the digital displays of the newer aircraft symbolized a fundamental shift in military aviation philosophy. The Air Force had invested everything in the belief that technological superiority would provide decisive advantages in future conflicts, but this faith had never been tested against enemies who understood how to counter advanced systems with asymmetric tactics. The morning sun climbed higher over the Nevada desert, and the pilots of the 64th Aggressor Squadron prepared for what they expected to be another routine training exercise. Their advanced aircraft, sophisticated weapons, and network-centric tactics represented the culmination of decades of technological development and billions of dollars in research and development. None of them could imagine that their technological advantages were about to prove worse than useless against an enemy who had spent years studying American capabilities and developing countermeasures that would render their most advanced systems ineffective. The coming hours would demonstrate that sometimes the most sophisticated solution was no solution at all, and that the oldest pilot in the squadron might also be the most valuable. The emergency klaxon pierced the desert air at exactly 0347 hours. Jolting pilots from their bunks with the urgent wail that every military aviator had trained to recognize, but hoped never to hear in actual combat. Red lights flashed throughout the squadron buildings as the base-wide announcement crackled over speakers that hadn't been used for real emergencies in over a decade. All pilots report to the briefing room immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Sarah rolled out of her bunk with the practiced efficiency of someone who had responded to similar alerts in 3 different decades. Her body moving automatically while her mind processed the implications of a middle-of-the-night scramble. Real-world alerts were different from training exercises, carrying an electric tension that made even veteran pilots move with heightened urgency. As she pulled on her flight suit, she could hear other pilots stumbling through their own preparations, their voices carrying the disorientation of sudden awakening mixed with professional adrenaline. The briefing room filled rapidly with pilots, in various states of readiness, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes, while others showed the alert intensity of career military officers accustomed to crisis situations. The wall-mounted displays that normally showed training scenarios now painted a very different picture: real-time satellite imagery of the Taiwan Strait, with symbols representing Chinese military forces in positions that suggested imminent action. Rather than routine exercises, Colonel Walker entered the room with the grim expression of someone who had spent the past 2 hours receiving classified briefings from Washington. Her normally perfect uniform showed the wrinkles of hasty dressing, and her eyes carried the weight of information that would fundamentally change the lives of everyone in the room. She moved to the podium with